The voice on the line was frantic. "My son just killed my wife!" The man's words tumbled out in a desperate rush, his breath heavy, erratic. Less than a minute later, another call came in, a younger voice, equally shaken. "My stepfather killed my mom." Two calls to 911, two men, one dead woman, and two completely different stories. By the time emergency responders arrived, the once quiet home in Seminole, Florida, had become a crime scene. Inside the modest suburban house, in the master bedroom, Diane Kyne lay motionless on her bed. The 49-year-old woman had no visible wounds, no blood, no sign of forced entry. Just the unmistakable marks around her neck, a silent testament to how she had died. Her husband, William Bill Kyne, was downstairs when the police entered. He was visibly distressed, pointing toward his stepson as officers arrived. "He did it! He killed her!" Meanwhile, Kevin Kyne, Diane's 23-year-old son, was in another part of the house, equally frantic. "No, no, my stepfather did this. He's lying." Detectives knew from the moment they stepped in that this was not a case of an intruder or a random act of violence. Whoever had killed Diane had been inside the house the entire time. The question now was, who? The Kynes were, by all appearances, a typical middle-class American family. Diane was a well-liked, hard-working woman who owned a small nail salon. She had married Bill years earlier, blending their families in what seemed like a fresh start. Bill, an older man with a quiet demeanor, had a past that few knew much about. He was practical, structured, and had an unshakable sense of control over his household. He claimed to love Diane, yet those close to her knew their marriage had its cracks. Then there was Kevin, Diane's only son. At 23, he was still living at home, unemployed, struggling to find his way in life. He had once been in the military, but was discharged early. His relationship with his mother was close, but with Bill, tense, volatile. Neighbors rarely heard shouting from the Kyne household, but Diane had confided in a close friend that things weren't perfect. "There's tension," she had said, "but it's nothing serious." Now she was dead, and one of the two men standing in her home had killed her. Police separated Bill and Kevin immediately, questioning them individually. Their statements were polar opposites. Bill said he had been downstairs when he heard a scream. He ran upstairs and found Diane on the bed, lifeless, with Kevin standing near her. "He was right there," Bill insisted. "I knew right away. He did it." Kevin, on the other hand, said he had been in another room when he heard his mother yell. By the time he got to her, she was already gone, and Bill was in the room. "He's lying," Kevin said. "He's trying to frame me." The immediate problem? There was no physical evidence to instantly confirm either story. There were no bloody weapons, no footprints, no immediate DNA evidence to suggest a struggle. Just a dead woman and two men pointing fingers at each other. Outside, neighbors gathered, whispering as uniformed officers moved in and out of the house. "They always seem normal," one woman murmured. "But you never really know what happens behind closed doors, do you?" Back inside, the lead detective surveyed the crime scene. It was unsettling in its simplicity. Diane had died in her own bed, in her own home, with no one to call for help. There was no sign of forced entry, no robbery, no ransacking, just a quiet, chilling finality to her death. If she had struggled, there was no evidence of it. That suggested one terrifying possibility. She had been attacked by someone she trusted. And yet, the deeper detectives looked, the murkier the truth became. Kevin had a temper. He had gotten into trouble before. But Bill, he had a past that, as the investigation progressed, would raise even more unsettling questions. This wasn't going to be an easy case. Someone in that house was lying, and the detectives needed to find out who, before one of them walked away a free man. The Kyne residence was no longer just a family home. It was a crime scene. Yellow police tape stretched across the entrance, fluttering slightly in the humid Florida air. Inside, forensic investigators moved methodically through the house, documenting every detail. The master bedroom, where Diane had taken her last breath, remained eerily undisturbed except for the small team of professionals combing through it. The bed was neatly made, except for the place where her body had been found. No overturned furniture, no shattered glass. Nothing that suggested a violent struggle. It was almost too orderly, as if someone had wanted it to look that way. Detectives knew that in cases like this, the crime scene itself often told the story, but the lack of visible evidence was unsettling. Diane had been strangled, yet there were no signs of defensive wounds on her hands or arms, no indication that she had fought back. That detail alone raised an uncomfortable possibility. She had either been caught completely off guard or had not perceived the threat until it was too late. While forensic specialists worked in silence, officers continued questioning Bill and Kevin in separate rooms. The contrast between them was stark. Bill, the grieving husband, was visibly distraught, his hands trembling as he recounted his version of events. He insisted he had been downstairs when he heard Diane scream and had run to find Kevin standing over her body. He spoke with certainty, claiming there was no doubt in his mind Kevin had killed his mother. Kevin, however, painted a different picture. He described hearing the commotion and rushing in, only to find Diane lifeless and Bill standing in the room. He denied any involvement, his voice laced with frustration and fear. He knew what it looked like, he said. He understood that it was just the three of them in the house. But he wasn't the one who had done it. Neither man's story changed. Neither man backed down. Outside, detectives canvassed the neighborhood, speaking with anyone who might have seen or heard something unusual. Most of the neighbors described the Kyne household as quiet, unremarkable. But one woman who lived just across the street hesitated before she spoke. She recalled hearing an argument earlier that day, muffled voices rising in intensity. She hadn't been able to make out the words, but she remembered one thing clearly. Diane's voice had been the loudest. It wasn't the first time she had heard shouting from that house, though she had never thought much of it. Families fought. People had disagreements, but this time felt different. The argument had stopped abruptly. Detectives made note of her statement, but without specifics. It was only a thread in a much larger web. Meanwhile, forensic investigators were beginning to piece together their own puzzle. They dusted the room for fingerprints, searched for any trace of DNA that could suggest a physical confrontation. But there was nothing conclusive. No blood, no broken items, no immediate evidence to pinpoint a suspect. The only undeniable fact was Diane's cause of death. Strangulation required close contact, physical strength, and intent. It was one of the most personal ways to kill someone. It was not an act of impulse. It was deliberate. As the hours passed, another troubling discovery emerged. Diane's phone had been found beneath the bed, screen cracked, as if it had been dropped in a moment of panic. When detectives accessed the call logs, they found something strange, a half-written text message that had never been sent. It was brief, almost cryptic. "I can't do this anymore." Who was she trying to text? What had she meant? The message raised more questions than answers. If she had been trying to reach out to someone for help, why hadn't she finished typing? Had she been interrupted? And if so, by whom? Investigators knew that time was crucial. The first 48 hours in a homicide case were often the most critical in determining what had happened and who was responsible. But this case was already tangled in contradictions. They had two witnesses, both of whom swore the other was guilty. No clear motive, no conclusive forensic evidence. Only a dead woman, a fractured family, and a house filled with secrets. The deeper they dug, the more unsettling the truth became. Someone in that house was lying. And the closer detectives got to the truth, the more dangerous the game became. The Kyne house had become a place of quiet unease. The once ordinary suburban home, nestled in a peaceful Florida neighborhood, now stood at the center of a murder investigation where nothing made sense. Inside, forensic technicians moved meticulously, their gloved hands collecting fibers, prints, and any trace of evidence that could provide answers. Detectives worked in shifts, their eyes scanning every inch of the house, looking for anything that might confirm what had happened that afternoon. The investigation had reached a frustrating standstill. Two men, two versions of the same event, and no immediate way to determine who was telling the truth. Bill Kyne was a composed man. Even in the midst of grief, he carried himself with a level of control that struck detectives as both calculated and unsettling. His story never wavered. He had been downstairs when he heard Diane scream. When he ran up, he found his wife lifeless on the bed and his stepson standing nearby. The implication was clear. Kevin had killed Diane in a fit of rage. But Kevin's story was just as unwavering. He had been in his own room when he heard his mother cry out. By the time he reached her, she was already gone. Bill had been the only other person there. Neither man had an alibi. The crime scene revealed little. There were no bruises on Diane's arms or hands to suggest a prolonged struggle. No items knocked over, no defensive wounds. The manner of her death had been cold and controlled, the work of someone who had either acted swiftly or had taken her by surprise. The absence of forced entry meant the killer had been inside the home before the attack. Everything pointed to the fact that Diane had known and trusted her killer. Detectives examined the strained dynamics within the household. It wasn't a secret that Diane had often found herself caught between her husband and her son. Kevin and Bill had a history of conflict, arguments that had escalated over time. Neighbors reported overhearing tension, nothing explosive, but enough to notice. Diane had confided in a close friend that she was exhausted from being the mediator between the two. But was frustration enough of a motive for murder? The results from the forensic team came back with little to offer. There were no unknown fingerprints or DNA at the scene. The only evidence present belonged to the three people who had lived there. The fibers on Diane's clothing were a mix of household fabrics. The dusting for fingerprints on surfaces yielded nothing beyond what was expected. The clean, undisturbed setting added to the mystery. If there had been a fight, why was there no sign of it? The autopsy confirmed what investigators already knew. Diane had been strangled. There were no indications of restraint or prolonged torture. She had died quickly. There was no alcohol or sedatives in her system. She had been fully conscious when it happened. The absence of signs of struggle suggested she had either been immobilized instantly or had not expected the attack. The one piece of evidence that investigators couldn't ignore was the half-written text message found on Diane's phone. It was short, unfinished, and chilling in its simplicity. "I can't do this anymore." Had she meant to send it as a warning? Was it a cry for help? Who had she been writing to? Detectives subpoenaed Diane's phone records, looking for any recent messages, calls, or contacts that might shed light on her final moments. But nothing stood out. There were no threatening messages, no sudden changes in her call history, no unusual patterns in communication. The lack of clear motive made the case even more difficult. There were no financial struggles that suggested a killing for money, no affairs, no outside threats, no history of domestic violence calls. Diane's life, at least on the surface, appeared stable. But if it had been, why was she dead? Kevin remained under intense scrutiny. His temper, his lack of employment, his history of clashing with Bill, everything about him made him an easy suspect. His past was marked with frustration, failed ambitions, and unresolved resentment toward his stepfather. He had everything to lose. But did that mean he had everything to kill for? And then there was Bill, a man with a history that investigators were beginning to question. He had been married before. His first wife had died under circumstances that now seemed worth re-examining. There had never been a formal investigation, but whispers of doubt had lingered. Was Diane's death another incident buried beneath a carefully crafted narrative? The deeper detectives dug, the more uneasy they became. Nothing about this case felt like an accident. Someone was lying. Someone had planned this. But for now, they had no way of knowing who. The deeper investigators dug into the Kyne household, the more unsettling the picture became. Diane's death was not a crime of opportunity. It was personal. The way she was killed, the lack of defensive wounds, the quiet precision of the act. It all pointed to someone close to her, someone she trusted, someone who had made a calculated decision that she would not survive that day. Yet despite the weight of evidence suggesting the killer was inside the house, there was still no undeniable proof pointing to which man had done it. Kevin remained the more obvious suspect in the eyes of many. He was younger, impulsive, prone to bursts of anger. He had been living under the same roof with Bill, a man he resented, a man who had authority over him, a man he had never truly accepted as family. He had no clear career path, no stable future ahead. His relationship with his mother had been close but strained, often put to the test by Bill's presence. If an argument had escalated, if emotions had boiled over, could he have lashed out? Then there was Bill. He played the role of the grieving husband well, but something about his composure unsettled detectives. His account of what had happened never wavered, but it was too perfect, too controlled, as if he had rehearsed it before ever opening his mouth. His demeanor was not one of a man blindsided by loss, but of someone carefully navigating an investigation. The history that had started to emerge about him only made things worse. Bill Kyne had been married before. His first wife had also died suddenly. Her death ruled an accident, but whispers of doubt had surfaced even then. There had been no signs of foul play, no real reason to suspect anything sinister, yet those who knew the woman had questioned the circumstances. Investigators reviewing the old case saw eerie similarities. No physical struggle, a clean, unremarkable crime scene, a death that seemed to leave no trace behind except the word of the man who had been closest to her. It was not enough to build a case, but it was enough to make detectives uneasy. As the investigation continued, forensic analysis of Diane's belongings turned up one unexpected detail. A second phone, separate from the one police had already examined. It was tucked away in the back of her closet, powered off, almost as if she had hidden it. When detectives accessed the data, they found something that changed everything. Diane had been texting someone regularly. The messages were brief, careful, but their tone was unmistakable. She had been afraid of something. She had talked about feeling trapped, about not knowing what to do. The messages never specified names, never directly accused anyone of wrongdoing, but they hinted at deep-rooted fear. One message sent just days before her murder stood out from the rest. "I need to find a way out of this." Who had she been talking about? Who had she been trying to escape from? The phone was a breakthrough, but it raised more questions than answers. If Diane had been planning to leave, had she confronted someone about it? Had the knowledge that she was ready to walk away led to her murder? As detectives worked to trace the identity of the person Diane had been messaging, tension inside the Kyne household was reaching a breaking point. Kevin and Bill, now separated, knew that one of them would eventually be charged. Each man remained steadfast in his version of the story. Each believed, or at least claimed to believe, that the other was the killer. But investigators knew that only one of them was lying. It was no longer just about solving the case. It was about uncovering what had been simmering beneath the surface of this family long before Diane died. And as new evidence slowly began to surface, the picture of what really happened that day was becoming more terrifying than anyone had expected. With each passing hour, the Kyne case grew more complex. Detectives were working tirelessly to unravel the events leading up to Diane's death, but the timeline was proving difficult to reconstruct. The lack of clear physical evidence meant they had to rely on circumstantial details, things that, when pieced together, could reveal the truth. The biggest problem remained the same. Bill and Kevin told conflicting stories and neither could be easily disproven. Investigators had two suspects, both alive, both insistent on their own innocence, and both present in the house at the time of the murder. But only one of them was telling the truth. The second phone hidden in Diane's closet had been a breakthrough, but it wasn't enough on its own. Investigators traced the number she had been texting in the days before her death. It belonged to a friend from her nail salon, a woman Diane had trusted enough to confide in. When detectives spoke to her, the picture she painted of Diane's final weeks was troubling. Diane had been afraid. She hadn't said much, but she had made it clear that something in her home was pushing her to the edge. She had mentioned feeling isolated, controlled, uncertain about what to do next. The messages hinted at fear, but never identified a specific threat. When asked directly whether Diane had ever expressed concern about Bill or Kevin, the woman hesitated before responding. She felt stuck, she admitted, like she didn't have any good options left. It was a vague answer, but it reinforced something investigators were already beginning to suspect. Diane had been struggling with something long before the day she died. The question now was whether that struggle had led to her murder. As forensic teams continued processing the crime scene, detectives focused on establishing a clearer timeline of Diane's final moments. They needed to know exactly when she was last seen alive, what she had been doing, and whether there was any evidence, any overlooked clue that could indicate how and when the attack had happened. Security footage from nearby homes provided little insight. No one had entered or exited the Kyne residence that afternoon. The last verifiable sighting of Diane had been just hours before her death, when she had briefly stepped outside to retrieve the mail. After that, the only people known to be in the house were Bill and Kevin. Inside, Diane's final movements remained a mystery. Her bedroom was undisturbed. Her belongings were neatly arranged. The bed showed no sign of a struggle. The only thing out of place was her phone, one discarded under the bed, the other hidden away, containing messages that hinted at a deeper story. Then something unusual surfaced. Digital forensic specialists retrieved location data from Diane's primary phone. Just minutes before her death, the phone had moved. Not outside the house, not to another room, but a shift significant enough to be recorded. The data suggested a brief but sudden movement, as if the phone had been picked up, carried, and then abruptly dropped. The timestamp placed it within the window of time when Diane was killed. This small but crucial detail meant that whatever had happened in that room had unfolded in a matter of seconds. There had been no prolonged confrontation, no drawn-out fight. It had happened quickly, efficiently, and then silence. The evidence only reinforced what detectives already knew. Whoever killed Diane had done so with precision. There was no hesitation, no chaos. The act had been deliberate. Investigators combed through the house once more, looking for anything they might have missed. They needed something, anything that could tip the balance in one direction. And then they found it. It wasn't large, it wasn't obvious. It had almost been overlooked entirely. A single shoe print, faint but present, located just inside the bedroom near the bed frame. The placement was odd. It wasn't in a high-traffic area, not in a spot where someone would naturally stand. It was a detail so small it could have been dismissed as irrelevant. But in a case where every piece mattered, it wasn't irrelevant at all. The question now was, whose shoe had left that print? The discovery of the faint shoe print inside Diane's bedroom reframed the investigation. Up until now, the case had been plagued by a frustrating lack of physical evidence. The crime scene was eerily undisturbed, as if the murder had left no trace. But now, for the first time, there was something tangible, something that could place the killer exactly where Diane had died. Forensic analysts examined the print carefully. It wasn't fully formed, just the partial outline of a sole, but it was enough to determine that it belonged to a sneaker rather than a dress shoe or a boot. The specific pattern suggested a common brand, but more importantly, it was not a print that should have been there. The area where it had been found was next to the bed, positioned in such a way that it indicated someone had been standing close to Diane's body at the moment of her death. Detectives immediately checked the shoes both Bill and Kevin had been wearing when they were taken in for questioning. Neither pair was a match. That didn't rule either of them out, but it meant that whoever left the print had either changed shoes or had been wearing a different pair at the time of the crime. The next step was to search the house again. Every pair of shoes inside needed to be examined. If they could find a match, it could become a key piece of evidence. Meanwhile, investigators continued to push into Diane's past, looking for any detail that might explain why she had been killed. The messages on her secret phone had already suggested that she had been feeling trapped, uncertain, even fearful. But the question remained, who had she been afraid of? The timeline of Diane's last hours was becoming clearer, but there were still missing pieces. Security footage from nearby homes confirmed that no one had entered or left the house in the time leading up to her death. That meant there were only two possibilities. Either Diane had been murdered by someone already inside, or something had happened that still wasn't accounted for. The shoe print, though subtle, indicated movement. The shift in her phone's location suggested an abrupt moment of action, and the strangulation itself, silent, efficient, implied the work of someone who had planned the act rather than acted impulsively. As investigators reviewed every angle, they returned once more to the dynamics inside the house. The tensions between Bill and Kevin were well documented. Their history of arguments, their struggle for dominance inside the home. Diane had been caught in the middle for years. She had played the role of peacemaker, the one who tried to hold the family together despite the fractures beneath the surface. But what if she had finally decided she couldn't do it anymore? If Diane had been planning to leave, that meant someone in the house had a motive to stop her. The forensic team continued its work, processing every possible source of evidence. Then a breakthrough. Inside Kevin's closet, tucked away beneath a pile of clothes, they found a pair of sneakers. They were slightly worn, their soles lined with dust from months of use. But on the bottom, faint yet distinct, was the same pattern as the print found in Diane's bedroom. It wasn't definitive proof of murder. A shoe print alone wouldn't be enough to convict anyone, but it was the strongest physical evidence detectives had so far. The shoes placed Kevin inside the bedroom, next to the bed, close enough to Diane to have been there at the moment of her death. It was the first time the investigation had leaned heavily in one direction, but detectives knew better than to rush. One mistake, one overlooked detail, and the entire case could collapse. As the forensic team documented the evidence, the focus of the case shifted. If Kevin had been in the room, then Bill's story that he had found Kevin standing over Diane's body suddenly seemed more credible. But there was still one question that no amount of forensic analysis could answer. Had Kevin been in the room before or after Diane had died? And until they could prove the answer, the truth remained just out of reach. The discovery of Kevin's sneakers matching the faint shoe print inside Diane's bedroom was the first real physical link tying him to the crime scene. But it wasn't enough. A shoe print only placed someone in a room. It didn't prove intent. It didn't prove guilt. It didn't prove whether Kevin had stood over Diane as she lay lifeless, or whether he had been there moments before, oblivious to what was about to happen. Investigators knew they needed more. The case was built on a foundation of contradictions. Two men with opposing stories, no witnesses, and a crime scene that was both disturbingly clean and eerily revealing. Every new piece of evidence added to the complexity rather than providing a clear answer. As the forensic team continued analyzing the details, detectives shifted their focus to Kevin's past. He had no history of violent crime, but he wasn't a stranger to conflict. His relationship with Bill had always been rocky, filled with resentment and tension. Living under the same roof had never been easy for either of them, and Diane had been the buffer between them. The investigators reviewing Diane's secret phone messages had already noted that she had been deeply unhappy. She had felt trapped. But what they still didn't know was who she had been afraid of. Had she been afraid of Kevin? Had his frustration boiled over into something deadly? Or had she been afraid of Bill, a man whose past was starting to raise unsettling questions? The forensic team found another critical detail, a slight smudge on the surface of Diane's phone, as if someone had gripped it roughly. The angle suggested it had been grabbed and then discarded quickly. That aligned with the motion detected in the phone's location data, confirming that something had caused sudden movement just before Diane's death. But the prints on the device were mixed, overlapping, Diane's, Kevin's, and Bill's. That too wasn't enough to be conclusive. It was expected. They all lived in the same house. They all had access to her phone. The investigation stalled again. The prosecution knew that without an undeniable connection between Kevin and Diane's murder, the case would be weak. They needed something stronger. They needed evidence that couldn't be explained away. Pressure mounted. The media had picked up the story, speculating about the fractured family, the mother caught in the middle, the son and stepfather, each claiming the other was a killer. Public opinion swayed back and forth. Some saw Kevin as a troubled young man with a history of resentment toward his stepfather. Others viewed Bill as a manipulative figure, a man whose past was quietly troubling. Investigators worked relentlessly, reviewing hours of interrogations, picking apart every detail, every hesitation, every inconsistency. And then something small, something almost insignificant, caught their attention. In one of his early statements, Kevin had said that after hearing his mother scream, he ran into her room and found her on the bed, already dead. His story had been consistent, unwavering. But when reviewing body cam footage from the initial police response, they noticed a slip. Kevin had mentioned the way her body was positioned. That information had not been made public at the time. It had not been something anyone outside the officers in that room should have known. It was enough to reopen the pressure, enough to tighten the focus on him. The detectives weren't just gathering evidence anymore. They were setting a trap. The pressure on Kevin Kyne was mounting. Investigators had spent weeks carefully constructing their case, examining every angle, every contradiction, every forensic inconsistency. They were dealing with a murder that had left no obvious smoking gun, no surveillance footage, no outside witnesses, no forced entry. Everything pointed inward. Diane had been killed by someone she knew, someone inside the house. And now Kevin had made a critical mistake. When reviewing his interviews, detectives had caught a single slip, a mention of how Diane's body had been positioned. It was a small detail, but one that stood out. At the time of his statement, that information had not been publicly disclosed. Only someone who had seen her in that state, before law enforcement arrived, could have known. It was the first real break in an otherwise tangled narrative. Detectives revisited the crime scene, reconstructing the moments between Diane's final text and the 911 calls. The footprint in the bedroom, the movement of the phone, the lack of defensive wounds, the absence of noise beyond the single scream. None of it suggested a prolonged attack. Diane had been killed quickly, efficiently. Someone had pressed down on her throat with controlled force, ensuring there was no opportunity for her to fight back. It required a level of intent that was chilling. With the new angle of inquiry, investigators pressed deeper into Kevin's behavior before and after the murder. His actions immediately after calling 911 had been chaotic, inconsistent. He had changed his description of events slightly in each retelling, not drastically enough to be blatant, but just enough to indicate uncertainty. First, he had claimed he ran into the room seconds after the scream. Later, he adjusted his timeline, saying he had hesitated for a moment before going in. A delay, a moment of hesitation, that mattered. If Kevin had been present at the time of the attack, even for a brief moment before Diane died, it would explain why there was no sign of a struggle. If he had stood there in shock rather than intervening, it would explain the controlled nature of the crime. It would mean he had watched, either paralyzed or complicit, as his mother lost her life. And then there was the footprint. It was his shoe. It was in the bedroom. And it had been left at the time of the crime. Yet the biggest problem remained. Investigators still had no clear motive. Kevin's history of tension with Bill was well documented, but his relationship with Diane had always been different. There had been no reports of violent arguments, no threats, no indications that he had ever posed a danger to her. His frustration, his resentment, his lack of direction in life, none of it had suggested the kind of anger that would turn into murder. That was the missing link. Why had Diane been killed? The investigators turned to a different strategy. They stopped looking at Diane's death as an isolated moment and started viewing it as the culmination of something bigger, a breaking point, a decision that had been forming long before that final afternoon. That was when they found the financial records. Diane had been making inquiries about removing Kevin from the home. The records showed that she had begun researching apartments, financial assistance, even potential job placements for Kevin. Her phone records contained emails to housing programs. In her private messages, she had hinted at the need for a fresh start. Diane hadn't just been thinking about leaving. She had been planning for Kevin to leave. And if Kevin had discovered that, it could have changed everything. It was a powerful revelation. Kevin had lived under his mother's protection his entire life. She had been the one person who had always stood by him, always defended him against Bill, always provided stability, even when his own life had been spiraling. If she had decided to send him away, to force him to stand on his own, what would that have done to him? Had he panicked? Had an argument escalated? Had he realized in a moment of rage that the one person he had always relied on was about to push him out? The pieces were beginning to fit, but there was still one last question. Had Kevin killed Diane alone, or had someone else played a part? The evidence against Kevin Kyne was stacking up, but detectives knew that building a strong case required more than circumstantial connections. The footprints, the misplaced details in his statements, and the movement of Diane's phone all pointed in his direction. Yet the biggest obstacle remained. Why? Diane's financial records had exposed a hard truth. She had been preparing for Kevin to leave. It wasn't just an idea. It was an active plan, something she had already started putting into motion. For a man whose entire life had revolved around his mother, that realization could have been devastating. If Kevin had discovered those plans, it could have set off a chain reaction, one that ended in tragedy. But there was one last complication that detectives couldn't ignore. Bill Kyne had just as much to gain from Diane's death. His history had become an uncomfortable topic of discussion among the investigators. The circumstances of his first wife's death were still considered an accident. But now, with Diane dead in a nearly identical scenario, it was impossible not to draw comparisons. Two wives, both dying suddenly. No clear struggle, no immediate evidence of foul play. Just the word of the man who had been closest to them. That pattern wasn't lost on the detectives. Bill had a financial stake in Diane's death. If she had been planning to remove Kevin from the house, she could have also been thinking about a future without Bill. Had she been preparing for an even bigger change? Had she been planning to walk away from both of them? And if so, had Bill known? The legal process was already beginning to move forward. The case was shifting toward an indictment, and Kevin remained the prime suspect. The forensic evidence was too significant to ignore. His shoe print in the bedroom, his knowledge of details he shouldn't have known, his changing timeline, and now a possible motive. The prosecution believed it had enough. The grand jury agreed. Kevin Kyne was charged with the murder of his mother. The courtroom was filled with tension when the case was formally announced. Kevin maintained his innocence. Bill remained composed. The media painted two narratives, one of a son who had snapped under pressure, another of a stepfather who had manipulated the situation to his advantage. But what no one could answer was whether Kevin had truly acted alone. As the case moved toward trial, questions still lingered. Kevin's involvement seemed undeniable, but Bill's presence in the house that day remained a shadow over the investigation. He had been there. He had given a statement. He had pointed the blame immediately at Kevin. Had Kevin truly killed his mother in an act of rage? Or had he been the perfect scapegoat for someone else's crime? In the end, the legal system made its decision. Kevin was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. But the truth? That remained something only two people knew, and one of them had just walked free. The trial had ended. The verdict had been delivered. Kevin Kyne had been found guilty of murdering his mother and was sentenced to life in prison. The case was officially closed. But for those who had followed every detail, for those who had combed through the evidence, and for those who had sat in that courtroom, one question remained. Had justice truly been served? Kevin never confessed. He never admitted to killing Diane. Even as the jury read their decision, even as the reality of a lifetime behind bars sank in, he held firm. He was innocent, he insisted. He hadn't killed his mother. He hadn't done what they said he did. But the evidence had told a different story. The shoe print in Diane's bedroom had belonged to Kevin. His inconsistent statements, his slip about how she had been positioned, and the timeline of events all pointed to him. The prosecution had presented a compelling case, one that, despite lingering doubts, had been enough for a conviction. Yet there was one person who had walked away untouched. Bill Kyne had been in the house that day. He had given his version of events early on, never changing his story. He had been the first to accuse Kevin, the first to say with certainty that his stepson had been the killer. And then, when the dust settled, he had simply returned to his life. No further investigation into his past, no deeper scrutiny into the death of his first wife, no trial, no charges. For detectives, it was a bitter conclusion. Some had their doubts. Some believed that the case hadn't been as clear-cut as the court had made it seem. The possibility that Kevin had been guilty was strong, but so was the possibility that he hadn't acted alone. The truth, whatever it was, had been buried the moment the trial ended. Kevin was locked away, Bill was free, and Diane Kyne, the woman who had tried to keep her family together, was gone. Years later, long after the case had faded from public attention, an anonymous letter arrived at the local police department. It contained no name, no return address, only a single sentence written on a torn piece of paper. "You got the wrong man. No one ever found out who sent it, and no one ever reopened the case. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.